as I've mentioned before in other videos, I don't think the 2016 NFL draft has a really good crop of cornerbacks in particular. In a draft that I don't think is all that great to begin with, this cornerback class is missing something. And it's just one of these things where you'll probably have some guys get drafted a lot higher than they actually should. Some guys that will get taken in round one that for all intents and purposes aren't round one talents and most years would have no business being first round picks. And one of those guys that I think of this year that probably will be a first round pick, but probably shouldn't be a first round pick in most other years is going to be Eli Apple, the 6'1", 200-pound redshirt sophomore corner from Ohio State. Now looking at him, from a eyeball test standpoint, this guy passes it very well, and there are a lot of things you could check off on him in the boxes, and you could say physically he's got good height and good length. 6'1", 200-pound corners don't grow on trees, especially 6'1", 200-pound corners with quickness and speed. And he showed you at the combine that he has quickness and speed, and I think you actually would see that on film too. I think there were certain assumptions about him that maybe he wasn't that athletic, or he wasn't that quick, or he wasn't that fast. Well, that just simply wasn't the case. And I think when you watch his film, you see a guy with good quickness, good speed, good overall athleticism for a guy of that size. Can turn his hips and run pretty well. Physically, from a package standpoint, he checks off an awful lot of the boxes. I'd like to see him get stronger, but he's got a good body to work with in terms of his physical tools. And that's going to be appealing to some NFL teams when you're looking at this corner class. And you got corners that are maybe too short, or corners that aren't long enough, or corners that aren't strong enough, corners that aren't fast enough. Eli Apple, from a physical tool standpoint, perhaps has the best complete package of physical tools of any corner in this year's NFL draft. And there's more about him that I really like. I see a guy that always strikes me as being very competitive, that plays hard. There's all these reports about his work ethic being tremendous. And I've seen some improvement out of him compared to his redshirt freshman year to his redshirt sophomore year. So based off of what I saw on film, there were marked improvements there. So I can back up what I see on film compared to what I've heard in terms of his work ethic, and based off of the situation and circumstances that he grew up in and where he has come from. I could understand that this is a guy that's going to appreciate his opportunity that he's given in the NFL. He's going to do everything he can to make the most of it and be one of those guys that, frankly, you find yourselves kind of rooting for. And I know I personally find myself kind of rooting for in Eli Apple to be successful at the NFL level. I also like at Ohio State, he ran both a lot of man and zone, so he has experience in both types of coverages being utilized in all different types of ways. I like the fact that he seems to be willing to come up and run support. Now, granted, he's not the greatest tackler, but I like that willingness. I like that competitiveness. I like that effort. I like that fight. Sometimes when you get cornerbacks, you sit there and you have to say, he doesn't tackle well, or he doesn't play hard in this area. He's not much in run support, but that's not what you pay him for. Well, at least in Eli Apple, you see the fundamental basis of what could be potentially a very well-rounded corner, a very well-rounded all-around football player. But in general, Eli Apple has a long ways to go. And there is a lot of work to be done. And there's a long road to hoe for this guy to reach his full NFL potential. And there are some serious questions, I think, about whether or not he actually will. Now, one thing he needs to do is get stronger. 6'1", 200 pounds. He should be stronger and more physical than he actually is. I think the will is there in terms of being strong and being competitive and playing hard and playing physical. Unfortunately, the skill of it by being stronger just isn't there. Now, that's something that you can work on. That's something you could fix. That's something that he can get better at. So just because he's not strong now doesn't mean that he can't get strong in an NFL strength training program. But he most certainly is going to be. When I look at him as well from a football IQ standpoint, you could see a guy that's not very experienced, a guy that's still very raw when it comes to the nuances of his position, the nuances of playing the game of football. So at times you see his awareness and his play recognition skills are a step behind others. This is a guy that I think sometimes could get bit on the play action fakes. He's sometimes a guy that can get a little lost in where he needs to be in terms of zone. He can be a little off in terms of anticipating on a man-to-man situation where that receiver is going to be going with their first move or their next step. And again, these are things that you can learn. These are things you can work on. These are things you can get better at. But there is going to be some major work needing to be done here because from a natural football IQ standpoint, Eli Apple doesn't have it compared to even defensive backs in the 2016 NFL draft. The major part of the work with him is going to come in the technique area in all respects. He needs to get better at his press technique. He needs to get better in his technique as a tackler because for a guy that big, he should be a better and more sure tackler than he actually ultimately is on the outside. He needs to get better in terms of his footwork. He needs to get better in setting up his body. He needs to get better in the technique of keeping a certain type of leverage so that way he can dictate and control where the wide receiver goes. He needs a lot of work on his technique, and it is going to take time for him to work on that technique. It is going to take time for an NFL coaching staff to coach up that technique. So this could be a guy that when he gets to the NFL, it might be a while before he actually sees the field on a consistent basis and really contributes because he's going to need a lot of work. In terms of an NFL comparison for him, I think about Jonathan Joseph several years back coming out of, I think it was South Carolina, a guy that had the physical tools. Now, Joseph was more ready to play at the NFL level than Eli Apple was, but Joseph took some time, in my opinion. But when he got it, and he became a very good corner at the NFL level. And I could see similar traits there for an Eli Apple, a guy with a lot of the physical tools that you like, with quickness and speed and all of that, but needing work on technique, needing to learn the game of football better. So it's going to take time. And I thought it took a little time with Jonathan Joseph, but he figured it out, and he figured it out very well. And I think Eli Apple can potentially do the same thing. Ultimately, I love the kid's story. This is a kid that was born in, I think it was either Nigeria or Ghana, I'm not sure, came here when he was 10 years old, took on his stepdad's surname of Apple. This is a guy that has worked hard to get into a position where he is. He has worked to get better, and I think he has grown and has gotten better. All the reports you ever hear about him is this is a guy that works really, really hard, that really, really wants it, and you see that competitiveness show through on the football field. And in the draft class that lacks for big-time talented corners with impressive physical tools, Eli Apple stands out to me as a cut above the rest, because he has the best combination of height, length, quickness, speed, athleticism of any corner, frankly, to me in this draft class. It's going to take time, though. In some ways, he probably would have benefited from going to school for another year to where he could have improved his technique, honed his craft, and maybe come 2017, he'd have been battling it out with somebody like Desmond King, Tre'Davious White, Cameron Sutton to be the #1 corner taken in that draft. And maybe he could have been. Maybe he would have been a top 10 pick next year. But the reality is he did declare this year. And the reality is, it probably wasn't the worst decision because, again, a guy all 21 years of age or whatever still has a chance to be a first-round pick. Now, for my money, I know that it's going to take 2 to 3 years before you really start to see Eli Apple's full potential or even start to see him come close to realizing that full potential at the NFL level. He might be one of those guys that really doesn't fully piece it together until you get halfway, if not almost all the way through his rookie contract, and that's when you really start to figure out where you want to go with this guy long term. It's going to take time, and a team's going to need to have patience, and if they put him in right away, they're going to have to understand that he will make some plays, and he will give up some plays, that he will be able to do some good things, but he's going to be lacking in other areas. So from an athletic tool standpoint, he's a first-round pick. He's probably, in terms of physical talent, in this draft, a top 15, a top 20 pick. In terms of the film and what you've seen, he's more of a 3rd or 4th round pick because he is very raw. He is a project. There's no question about that, and it's going to take him time. But that payoff could be tremendous. So when you balance it out, to me, he's a 2nd-round prospect in this draft. With the physical tools of a 1st rounder, with the actual game and refinement of technique of a 3rd, maybe even more so 4th rounder. Balance that out in the middle, 2nd-round pick, guy that you maybe want to gamble on in round 1 somewhere after pick 20 just because of the fact that he's got those physical tools, and if he can become what you anticipate his physical tools say that he becomes, he could become a marquee player out of this draft at a marquee position. Teams are desperate to find #1 corners, and Eli Apple does have #1 corner potential. But there is some potential for bust here. There is some potential that this guy doesn't piece it together and he doesn't figure it out. He's just not naturally a good enough football player, and he will always be that physical tease where you expect him to be more than he is, and you think that he's more than what he actually is. So for me, I would personally probably stay away from him in round 1 entirely, even though I understand, especially once you get to about pick 18 and on, the temptation's going to be there because you might gamble on the physical tools and the upside and the quickness, speed, athleticism, size combination. I get that. And in this draft, I won't knock that as much. I personally would feel more confident picking him in maybe in the first 10 picks of round number 2. That's where I think his value is when you balance everything out. But I do think he's a guy that if you took him there, does have the potential in a couple of years to look like he should have been a first-round pick. When you remock it in 3 years, you'll be sitting there maybe saying that this guy should have been a top 10 or top 15 pick because his upside is that big. You just have to get him in the right situation with the right coaching staff where he can start off as a number 2 corner, even come in as a role player initially, because it's going to take time and it's going to take work for him to achieve his full potential.